Welcome to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Tracey Enerson Wood. Tracey, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jennifer. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
I am so glad you're here, and I would love for you to get started with how'd you get into writing?
Well, I think I was almost like born with a pencil in my hand. I've always been writing. And I actually went to Catholic school for the first few years of my education. And the nuns were very insistent that we write. It was maybe because there was like 50 kids in the class. I'm a baby boomer. And that was something you could do to keep them all occupied. But we wrote and we wrote and we wrote, and and I actually had a big bump on my fingers from holding a pencil for so long. But we were also rewarded for it. When I wrote, we did a lot of like creative writing that the teacher would say, write about this. I remember writing about a tulip, about a box of tulips. That was kind of like our prompt, we would call it now. And, I'd write these just, fantasy sort of stories. And I remember I was maybe, I don't know, third, fourth grade or so, 8 or 9 years old. And I remember the teacher asked me to come up and read what I had written. I'm like, wow, from the whole class. Whoa. I'm like, okay, so I did, and I found out that, well, you know what? I like that part as much as I like maybe even more than the actual writing part. I loved, seeing people's reactions and just being, called up and being, kind of special, and getting to read my work was just really fulfilling. I should mention I'm one of six children, so and anything you could do, and a middle child, anything I could do to kind of get noticed, I wanted to do. So I like that, and maybe that's why I first was attracted to well, always writing stories and nonfiction, but I was attracted to playwriting and screenwriting first before I had written novels, and uh, and I think that came from just writing a few short plays and then seeing them magically appear up on a stage with my words coming out of other people's mouths. But the most amazing thing was what the actors brought to it. How my stories and what was in my head wasn't necessarily what they saw, what they got out of the story, because what they got out of the story came from their own experiences and what they needed to get out of it. So I was just really hooked on on both the writing and getting people to read or recite or perform it. It just I love it.
No, but I love that. And so, to your point about screenwriting or playwriting, how did that translate over to writing historical fiction, for instance? Because that background, that type of writing, I think lends to your point, there's a lot of commonality of the you're creating the world, you're creating the pieces, but I see a lot of that too as dialogue helping.
Yeah.
So how did that help you and translating that over to historical fiction, for instance?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and you know what? I love dialogue, and I probably put ooh, maybe that much too much in my books because I just love it. I love it when I read it. It brings the characters alive, and you can tell so much more just on their phrasing and stuff than just going and just sort of telling what they did or what they said, just put it out there in their languages, and or not their language because I only write in English, but in their phrasing, I should say. But I got into historical fiction. Well, I've always loved history. Um, but I wasn't the greatest history student, to tell you the truth, because I found it kind of dry and kind of written by men, about wars and about dates. I liked it because of the excitement of it, but I really liked historical fiction because the things I like about story are the dialogue, are about the characters, are the emotions, the feelings, the relationships. Those are the things that make a story fun and come alive. And so I discovered, huh, in historical fiction, I can put some history in there. So, so we're learning something or reading it or writing it. At the same time, it can be entertaining. It can be fun. We can use our imaginations to know and feel what it really was like to live in that era. So that's why I read it and write it, because it just makes, it's sort of history light, makes it more fun and puts you there. But my very first book, The Engineer's Wife, I wrote because it was actually it wasn't that I wanted to write about the Brooklyn Bridge. That's actually not how it happened. It was I came into it like everything in life backwards. So I wanted to write a play, and I wanted to write a play about a certain concept, and that concept was about a family, an intergenerational family that did something that was dangerous, that was then passed down through the generations. And the reason I was fascinated with this concept was because I was in a military family. And my father was in the army in the war. My father-in-law, my husband was a veteran of 27 years. My son, at this time, I was starting to think of this concept, had followed his father into the army because that's what he grew up. It's what he knew. That was his world, and so it seemed very natural to him, and that's what he did. Well, don't you know, he picked probably the most dangerous occupation in the army. He was one of if you've heard of it was called EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, the bomb squad guys and the big suits and the robots and stuff. So
Yeah.
his job was to go out and find the IEDs that people kind of called in strange package on, route number 7. And he and his team would go out and, explode it or, whatever they needed to do. So he always claimed it was not dangerous because he was the one who was prepared and knew, you know, what it was. But anyway, so I'm the mother of a son who's in a dangerous occupation, who followed his father, who was also, in a dangerous occupation, of course. And so I wanted to write about that concept. I wanted to write it because I was interested in the family dynamics of it. And I wanted to write a play and to look at what happens when we have a family of architects, and you send the son out, and he falls off the 100-story building back in, when they were building skyscrapers, and they're just out there walking around the I beams with with no tether or anything. So I thought, what happens when they go home for dinner and they talk about this? So that's really what I wanted to look at. And so I started looking at families who did dangerous things. And I grew up in northern New Jersey. And so New York City was kind of our Oz. That was that was where everything happened. That was the big city. So I thought that'd be a great place to work with. There's so much to work with there. And I figured I'd find a family that was building those skyscrapers. I was so familiar with the pictures of the guys sitting on I-beam, swinging the legs and eating a sandwich, 100 stories up in the air. You've probably seen those very famous
Mhm.
pictures. So that's the family I was looking for. But apparently, that doesn't really seem to run in families too much. At least it didn't then, or at least I couldn't find the right family. But what I did find was the Roebling family. And I found out about John Roebling, who emigrated from Germany because he had this dream of building bridges that he wasn't able to do in Germany, who tragically died while building his dream bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, but passed it off to his son, who was also followed him as being an engineer. And then, of course, his son took ill and passed it down to his wife. Well, that was the moment when I discovered Emily Roebling, how she saved the Brooklyn Bridge, and nobody really knew about her. I'd been over the bridge many times. I barely heard the name Roebling. Had never heard of Emily. And I found this woman whose story had not been told. It was an amazing story. I said, I got to read this book. I got to read all the novels. I got to read all the stuff. And nobody had written the novel about her. There's one little biography about her, very dry. It's good. Lots of good information, but not like entertaining, fun like I wanted to read. So that's when I knew I had to write it, and that's when I got into novel writing. and then several years of taking courses and trying and failing at other stories first. But that was it. That was the moment when I transitioned from playwriting, screenwriting, and some nonfiction into writing novels.
That is amazing because what you've also talked about too is what I'm hearing is you really picking up on the setting too that you want to create for that book. So using the space that you wanted to sounds that you're talking a bit about the research that you might need to do for historical fiction in order to for that time, that book, those characters to feel real because they're going to talk a certain way that we might not do now. We might they might say things a little differently, just like you were alluding to earlier in the dialogue, where they might say something completely different. It might sound more proper, or they might
Yeah.
structure something altogether that it would befit that time. And so it sounds to me like the research that you were doing was really helping to not just figure out the setting, the places that you wanted to explore to potentially write, but to your point, really was figuring out what characters did you really want this to to tell? What characters did you want to talk about or help them tell their own story? That's just that's really, really so cool. So, how did you go about developing Emily so that she felt real inside a book, but yet fiction? So, how did you go about developing her? I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, well, Emily was just a wonderful character. And fortunately for me, I grew up not far and in the same kind of geographical area. So I was already kind of familiar with the flora and the fauna. And of course, she grew up on the Hudson River in Cold Spring, New York. So the area was very familiar to me. I spent my childhood tramping through the woods just as I knew she did. And there is a wonderful biography about her and called Silent Builder by Marilyn Weigold that actually put her letters in there, and or actually more probably letters from Washington. So reading those letters and hearing their own words was a big part of it. So, there's that kind of research. There's, being on the ground. There's reading whatever you can get your hands on. And another resource I really love was getting the actual physical paper copies of the newspapers and journals of the time. One of those that's actually fairly available because they made so many of them was Harper's Bazaar. And so I bought on eBay every time they came up, especially when I knew because you could check kind of what's in them. Uh, Something big or there's a picture of John or whatever, or there's because it was covered a lot in Harper's Bazaar, and there was just something about having that actual paper, even though it's kind of delicate, and seeing the written language as it existed
Yeah.
really helps you feel like you're in that world because you're right, building is a huge part of historical fiction and one of my favorite parts to write and definitely one of my favorite parts to read because that's why we read it. We want to feel like we're there in that space. And what does it feel like? I actually another one of my experiences that actually happened before I started writing the book, but I fell back on it. Is as I mentioned, my husband was military, and at one time we were stationed up in Alaska, and in Alaska, Sitka was the first capital of Alaska. It's Juneau now. But anyway, Sitka is where they had the ceremony when the United States bought Alaska. I promise there's a point to this. I'll get to it. So Sitka is where they had a ceremony every year to celebrate and reenact the Russians selling Alaska to the U.S., which happened in I think it was 1854. I want to say. Don't actually count me exactly on that, but thereabouts. So anyway, every year the people of Sitka, and it's a small city, not no longer the capital. The people of the town would dress up in their 1854 clothes and have a big parade and have a whole like week of events. And they would dress up. The women would dress up as Keystone cops with all the stuff and go around and kiss all the soldiers. And so every year they would invite an army unit to come and celebrate with them. and they would do it historically because the historical unit that was there for the actual time in 1850 was the Ninth Infantry, and my husband happened to be in that unit, was then 4-9. So they invited his whole battalion to come down and celebrate with them for this way, be in the parades and dress up in costume. And there was balls and there was mustache contests. Anyway, I get informed that okay, so make sure you come in your best 1854 costume. I'm like, I don't actually have that. And I'm told, don't worry. The mayor of the town makes them. She makes plenty of them. You just come down and she'll just find one that works for you and you're just gonna pick it out and that's gonna be your costume. I go, okay, I'm game, So I go down there and sure enough, there's all these amazing dresses with the petticoat things, with the hoops and the skirts and everything. And
Wow.
and they didn't do bustles back then. This is pre-bustle, thank goodness.
Okay.
But the big skirts. So for like 3 or 4 days, I had to walk around in this ginormous dress with hoops and stuff and try getting in a taxi cab with a hoop, you know. So anyway, so then that having that experience, I think really informed what it felt like to do things and the things that Emily would have to do in that kind of dress because it hadn't changed much from 1854 to 1870. And what kind of challenges would she have? And of course, tying in the history with Amelia Bloomer and women starting to kind of revolt against us because there's just some things they couldn't do. And so getting to tie that in and tying in progress of women at the time all stemmed back from that experience of wearing a hoop skirt and have to mention it because it was kind of funny. They had this I had to sit up on the stage like a firing squad, like because my husband was a senior person in the battalion with the mayor and all the people up on the stage, and then the rest of the town, the entire town was down there and just staring up at us, and on the stage, and we had to eat in front of everybody. So, but then we tell me, okay, so you're going to be a judge for the beard contest. And I'm like, okay, I can judge beards, whatever. Well, what I didn't know is they were going to blindfold me. And they lined up all the men in town that had beards, and I was to go blindfolded down the line and check out their beards and proclaim a winner. So I tell you, it was a lot of fun.
But it sounds like a lot of reenacting. And the reenacting was something that was also helpful to not just to your point about the research when you can read the different pieces like the Harper's Bazaar or what have you, but to experience it in some ways, like
Yeah.
to your point, wearing the actual dress with a to wear a hoop skirt and to really have to negotiate through that and doors and things like that. I mean,
Yeah, just the simplest things, or
yeah, yeah,
never mind
but
going through a hatch to a caisson.
exactly, exactly. So to me, it sounds like just the more you that you're exposed to other ways of learning about the period
Yes.
that you're interested in, however you can go about that helps in order to bring that realism into your writing so that you feel those characters, you feel
Feels it.
in
You
like
gotta
the
smell the
world.
smells, you've gotta see the world, you've gotta feel the world, you need to have those textures against your skin. If you're writing about men with beards, you better have touched them. It's everything. You need when you're writing, you need to involve all the senses. It's I'm a kind of a visual person, and that's my go-to, but it's really important to develop that world to use all of them. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like on your fingertips? What does it feel like against your cheek? Not just what you see, not what you remember, not just what you hear.
To your point also with world building, um, when I think of that, I'm also thinking about, and I'm going to use the word rules, but in the context of saying, okay, there are some things that we can do, and there are some things that we can't do, whatever those systems are for that space. So, what I'm thinking of is, for instance, if we're talking about 1854 type of thing, they're not going to have a cell phone, so we can't talk about cell phones in
Of
that
course.
context. What were they bumping up against? How did they communicate? How did they get in different, you know, how did they do different things? So what is that like? What would you recommend rather for readers or writers who are trying to figure out that world and figuring out what to keep, what to not, like how to build out the rules, if you will?
Yeah, it's technology is one of the big things that you have to consider because our technology has so completely changed communications, and you have to be so careful about like every little a piece of knowledge you want your characters to have. You better know how they got that knowledge. If this right now, I mean, news is national. News was not national then, and it took much longer for important news to disseminate. So you can't, for example, have a character in New York, say, state, know what's happening on the bridge they're building in St. Louis, Missouri when it happens. That so there's just things like that, but it's not so much it's like, well, I think it's pretty obvious you don't have them using a cell phone unless you're writing, some kind of alternative fiction. But there's much more subtle things like that. The timing and the locality of information was very different and changed. Like even in my book spans 13, 14 years. So things changed. Things, huge. That was a time of big change. We think of big change now, but electricity was starting was just getting started, and they did have electric lights on the bridge. By the time it opened, but they had no electricity all during building it. So you have to do a lot of research to find out. Okay, I remember I wanted to write just about a puddle on the street of Brooklyn for a scene because it was a sort of a very sad contemplative scene towards the end of the book, and in my mind I could see the rain having made this pattern on the cobblestone streets. But where did the light come from? Did they still have gas lamps in 1883 in Brooklyn? Were they electrified? Was it candles? Were there no lights? So you have to be so careful about every a detail like that, which may wind up to be one word in the book. The gas lights came on at sunset. Maybe one line. Probably took me, a day or two of research to get it just right, of course. And that's one of the things we like to call a rabbit hole. And I'm a notorious for going down a rabbit because I want to know that one little piece of information, and while you're down this rabbit hole, discovering what was electrified in 1883, all these other things come out, and it's interesting, and you just want to learn more and more and more, and so it takes much longer, of course, than it did to find that little bit piece of information because you're learning so much more. But here's a tip for writers: you do learn a lot of really interesting things. Not all those interesting things belong in your book. And the temptation is there, believe me, when you find, this cute, interesting little crumb, and the temptation is to find a way to get it in there. And sometimes you do, if I can work it into the story organically so that it's part of the world building, that it has a reason for being there, then it's okay. But you just can't every detail, even though it's a detail it's important to the world building, needs to be there for a reason because how it affects your characters. You need to know as the author, how your characters are reacting to it and what details that character would notice. Not that, maybe you're really into carrots and you love their little frilly tops and how they taste and stuff. I'm like, that's great. You're in a field of carrots because that's what you love. But how's that relate to your character? Would your character notice those frilly light green tops? No, this is Washington. He's an engineer and he's into rocks and bridges. So no, he's not noticing the frilly carrot tops. But Emily, who did love art, maybe she did. So tying those details that you come up with that are historically accurate um, needs to also tie in with what your character would notice.
Absolutely. Well said. S- Switching gears just a little bit, tell me about the ward nurse.
The Warners, it's me behind me here. I'll say
Hmm.
I'll try to hold the book up. You can see the whole cover. It's a little harder with my background, but I'll try. You see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's pretty.
So I'm very proud of this. I haven't mentioned. I didn't mention that I'm a military wife, but what I haven't mentioned is I was a registered nurse, and I worked as a registered nurse for about 25, 26 years, something like that, following my husband around everywhere and kind of starting at the bottom everywhere because I was always new, Uh, so anyway, that was my life. It was my love, and I did it for many years. So when it came time to pick a heroine for my next novel, because my editor and my agent told me that's what I did. I write historical fiction about women who did amazing things that we don't know about. Like, oh, okay, I didn't know that, but I was told that. Like, all right, I wrote The Engineer's Wife, as I said, for completely different reasons, but that then I realized was me. That's who I did. Okay, good to know. So, but like, yeah, that's actually pretty cool. So I knew for my next heroine that I wanted to write about a nurse. I just write what you know is a good guideline. But there's just so many really interesting things about being a nurse, and I knew that I could really get into that character and I feel a lot of what she felt, even though, of course, it was a completely different time in history. So I wanted to find a nurse, but I was not going to write about Clara Barton or way back Florence Nightingale, and anybody that you would actually have heard of. I wanted to discover a very special nurse uh, that did amazing, interesting things that we hadn't heard of. So, okay, there's that a nurse who did amazing things that we don't know of. Easy peasy. And then the last thing was to pick an era to write about. And I wanted to kind of move forward in time a little bit from my first novel ended in 1883, and I kind of envisioned sort of a handoff, I should say, from what women were accomplishing to the next generation of women. So I'm thinking about that time frame, which brings us into the Gilded Age, or the end of the Gilded Age, and more of the Edwardian age, and World War One era. I knew I didn't want to go all the way to World War Two, because even though it's a very fascinating time, there's already a lot of books out there and a lot more coming now, also covering the women's stories. So I'm like, I don't want to compete with that, but there aren't very many books in American literature about World War One and that era, possibly because our country wasn't involved in it actively for that long, just a year, and it was so overshadowed by World War II. But there were some really interesting things that happened in medicine and nursing at that time. The first time that they were able to preserve and give blood was huge. Using disinfectants was huge. Anesthesia started in the Civil War, but was really kind of coming on its own then. They didn't have antibiotics, so that gave a lot of challenges, of course. And World War One, of course, was horrific in the end with the injuries and the invention of poison gas. To top that off, we had the Spanish flu occurring during World War II, which had many tie-ins for what we all had gone through. So for all those reasons, like, I knew the era I wanted to write about. So then it was finding a nurse. And I discovered the story of Julia Stimson, who thankfully her father had collected all the letters she had written from the front and put them in a book. So I had access to some wonderful letters she had written. But what she did was just so amazing to me. She was basically, was a director of nursing, just civilian nurse working in St. Louis. Was really progressive at the time. Was really moving forward with making nursing a profession. It was a little bit controversial because she was strong-willed, and the doctors didn't always like it. Like, good, it's all good for my character. But she was tasked with recruiting and training 64 more nurses to go to the front over in Europe before we had troops there because the Americans weren't ready with troops and units and weapons. But what the British and the French were desperately asking for was doctors and nurses. So that's who went over first. Another detail I didn't know, because a lot of people don't know that. And so that's what she did, and she took over a British hospital, took over the nursing staff, I should say, of a British hospital, brought in her own nurses, and was there for the duration, and then went on, after my book ended. But she went on and did some amazing things as a great leader in nursing. And I'm sorry I had never heard her story, but very proud to bring it to life. So that's the war nurse.
That is really cool. So I have 3 questions for you left, really, but
Okay.
one of which is what are you working on now? And then how can people connect with you and how can they get your books?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, again for hosting and asking me to come. And it's been a blast. As you might can tell, I love blabbing about my books. So what I'm working on now is my third novel, and again. I chose a woman in history that did some amazing things that we don't necessarily know about. This woman is a little bit better known, however, and a little bit more modern in history, still sort of the World War I era. But I'm writing the story of Edith Wilson, the second wife of Woodrow Wilson, sometimes also known as our first female president, because she was married to Woodrow Wilson when he was in office for the last part of his first term and his entire second term, and he had a severe stroke and was incapacitated. And rather than stepping down, she and a very close circle um, basically ran things for the rest of his presidency, which was huge in that this was the time they were trying to develop the League of Nations, working on the Paris treaties, with the biggest thought being, how do we make these treaties? How do we create this League of Nations in order to prevent another war? Because there was still, so much unrest, there was so much anger, so much hurt. It was just such a terrible time. And then in the middle of this, and that was his dream, of course, the League of Nations. Middle of this, he has a stroke, and she just kind of blunders through. And so it's going to be named The President's Wife, kind of following my theme, the engineer's wife, the war nurse. And we're going to have The President's Wife is going to be released next August. So not 22, August of 23, I should say. So very proud of that too. I think it's just a really, really amazing story and really interesting time frame. Of course, this one will be based in the U.S. with some scenes in France because hey, they went to France. I'm going to France, and I did get to go. I went to do some research there. So
Shucks, darn.
I know someone had it. I did for the war nurse actually too, when got to visit the city where the hospitals were based, because there were actually several hospitals in Rouen in Normandy. So I, just had to go around Normandy and in Paris. Got to make it real.
Well, where can people connect with you, Tracy, and where can they get your books?
Okay, well, the easiest thing to do is to go to my website, tracyenersonwood.com. And from there, there are links to all my books, but they are available from Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Indie Books, anywhere. And if your local bookstore doesn't have it in stock, they can order them. They're all in print and audio and Kindle and digital. And any way you want to read or hear, they're all easily available. And get it from the library. Many of my books are also available in libraries, and if it's not, you can request it from your library system. I love libraries, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with borrowing a book from the library.
Very cool. Tracy, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's just been a blast, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and keep on doing what you're doing. It's really important. Books are so important.
Thank you.